The U.S. and Pakistan have always had a fairly tense relationship in the sense that the U.S. has always seen Pakistan as an instrument to some other big U.S. objective. So, I mean, in a way, used Pakistan. Now, states do that all the time. Pakistanis have always known they were being used and gone along with it in part to use the U.S. to do something else, which was always to fight India or to contest India or compete with India. So in a way, the relationship has always been one of those kind of things that wasn't really built on trust or commonality of values or purpose, but it was very utilitarian, but in a semi-duplicitous way from the beginning. I mean, this goes back to the 50s and 60s, 70s. And so that's kind of continued. And it happened again after 9/11, basically, when the U.S. had pulled out of Pakistan between 1990 and 2000 because we were shocked to find that Pakistan had nuclear weapons in 1990, and so we had to impose sanctions that had been legislated earlier, and basically pulled back. Well, the Pakistanis knew they had nuclear weapons. They also knew that we had these laws on the book that we had done with their help to actually ease the supply of aid to them in the 80s. And that if it was found they had nuclear weapons, that there would be sanctions. So everybody knew that, but nonetheless it was dismaying, upsetting. So we were estranged for 10 years. During that time, Pakistan cultivated the Taliban. So after 9/11, the U.S. comes back in, and Pakistan in some sense reacts by saying, whoa, where the hell have you been? I mean, now you guys come back. And we came in very heavy-handed. We'd just been attacked. And so the U.S. administration went in and said, all right, enough of that. You've got to switch sides, basically, and turn against these guys. And you've got to help us and work with us to go after al-Qaeda and get rid of the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Well, Pakistan did that under duress. They were, in their various accounts, we were threatened physically, we were threatened with bombing. I don't believe that, but I think you could have inferred from the body language that people were really pissed off and serious. And then President Musharraf and others tried to turn that switch into something in Pakistan's own interest, to put Pakistan back on a more modern course. Well, that didn't work, and again, mainly because of the obsession with India. So there were still elements, as there still are today, in Pakistan, in the military and the intelligence services, that say, no, we need to support these jihadi guys, these guys with guns, to go after India, either directly in Kashmir and India, or now we're fighting to keep India out of Afghanistan, to keep Indian advantage from growing in Afghanistan. And therefore, we don't share the same objectives as the Americans, because the Americans say, you got to get rid of all these guys and all the terrorists, and Pakistan doesn't share that same objective. Their feeling has been that once the U.S. gets done in Afghanistan, that Pakistan will have to still protect its interests there. And remember, the Northern Alliance, the other parts of Afghanistan, don't support or are kind of mortal enemies with the Taliban, who are Pashtuns. Pakistan's associated with the Pashtuns, so they're looking at a future in a different way than the U.S. And so they never have been fully on board with U.S. interests or agenda. And the U.S. Therefore hasn't been so sensitive to Pakistani sovereignty and the issue of violating airspace. Now, the drone attacks were done with Pakistani knowledge, but the U.S. view has been, we've got a job to do. We were attacked. We're going to do stuff. We'd like to do it with you, but if not, we'll do it against you. So that's been an inherent tension in the relationship all along. And it was there throughout the last decade as well. It's become more acute now because of the Osama bin Laden thing, and because the crisis in Pakistan has gotten so much more severe, and because the war in Afghanistan, kept taking a turn for the worse in around 2007, 2008. It was so clear that Pakistan was supporting these guys that were making the objectives in Afghanistan impossible to be achieved. The Osama bin Laden killing, I think, could have gone several ways, but the way it went actually was harmful to relations, and I think mainly at the choice of the Pakistani military, who were embarrassed by it. But they could have come out and said, "Good riddance. He was violating our sovereignty by being here. He's a terrorist, and good riddance to him." They didn't say that. They chose to emphasize that the U.S. had not consulted them and had violated their sovereignty, their airspace, in conducting the raid. Once that became the narrative, and there were other things that had happened before this, the Davis thing, the CIA contractor who killed a couple of Pakistani intelligence operatives in February of 2010. 2011. So there was background of tension that was brewing, but the Osama bin Laden killing really made the Pakistani army stand up out of hurt pride, basically, and out of humiliation, and kind of try to shift the blame to the U.S. At a time when the competence of the Pakistani army was being questioned as never before. How could you let the Americans get in and you didn't know it, and so on? And then there was a raid on a naval base a couple of weeks after that was humiliating. So in this humiliation, they tried to focus on the U.S. and on the measures they were taking to basically punish the U.S. for this. So I'm still tough and in charge because now we don't want the American aid, or we're going to kick out and not give permission for American intelligence operatives to be here. And that actually, to some CIA and other operations that were going on, counterterrorism operations, those responses by Pakistan actually had an impact. And so that made people in the U.S. more angry in the intelligence services. And so you see at times the CIA doing things that are clearly sending a signal to the Pakistanis and to some in Washington, we're really angry and we're going to pound these guys, even when those in Washington and other parts of Washington are saying, well, let's try to heal things with the Pakistanis, let's make nice. So there's lots of undercurrents of conflict and tension between the two. Pakistan, in many ways, has from its founding in the late 1940s, been a crisis looking for an identity. It was founded in terrible circumstances, difficult circumstances, and the difficulties were, many of them were by just British indifference or lack of foresight. So it was a violent partition. And they built a country, and whose economy actually did well in the late 50s and mid 60s, but where there were always fundamental divisions, and there was not an identity as Pakistan. So you had Punjabis in what was then West Pakistan. You had who dominated the army and much of the leadership. But the majority of the population lived in East Pakistan, which was 1,000 miles away in what is now Bangladesh. Big cultural tensions, economic tensions between the two wings of Pakistan. And then within West Pakistan, tensions that are still there today between Punjabis and the Baluchi. Sindh today, where Karachi is the biggest city in Pakistan, it's as we're speaking today, it's virtually shut down. There's been rampant violence and lots of killings. The army may be called in Karachi. Well, these are long-running tensions within Sindh, within Karachi, but also between Sindh and the other provinces. So you had all of these internal rifts. You had the rich landowners who have never paid taxes in Pakistan, have never contributed their share of the public good, and they still don't. So all of these internal problems, the big one with East Pakistan led to the war in 1971, a civil war between East and West Pakistan, which created Bangladesh. But they've never healed these internal wounds. Now, the army has always run the country, always. In the majority of years, the army has run the country. It's always been the most influential institution. And by definition, it hasn't solved or even come close to solving any of these problems because they all still exist. But an army's not suited very well to actually reconciling identity questions, ethnic questions, sharing questions of economic resources. The only way to do that that's worked over time is through democratic processes. You have to let people represent themselves and figure out ways to mediate and reconcile issues. And that's never taken hold in Pakistan. And so all of it taken together means it's a country in deep, deep crisis. There's no positive story in Pakistan. People don't have a hope for the future. There's tremendous violence. There's economic corruption. Any problem, you name it, it's in Pakistan. And the army all these years has said, our threat is from India. Let's focus on India, which, whatever you think about India, right now India just wants to leave Pakistan alone and be left alone by Pakistan. But focusing on India has allowed the army to kind of try to get people not to pay attention to the internal problems, but they can't avoid it anymore. The internal problems are simply overwhelming, but there's no one there really mobilizing to try to solve them. The hope that's there is that there are many very talented, very well-intentioned and committed Pakistanis. You find them mostly in the bigger cities, and they are deeply frustrated, and they see all of the internal problems and they articulate them now. They know the military is not the solution. So there's a hope in that talent and in the sensibilities of those people. Now, that's at the moment as far as the hope goes, because they're not organized. They're not making alternative political parties. They're not organizing in kind of a protest movement that could sweep out the army and so on. Now, one reason, unlike Egypt, for example, people say, well, why doesn't Pakistan have a revolution like Egypt? Well, Pakistan has real elections, so they actually, vote in these people, not the army, but the government they have. So if you were going to go into the street, you're not going to demand elections because they already have elections. You could demand that the army and the intelligence services get out of things, but they can say, well, we're not in them, we have elections, and the government's corrupt, and people elected them, and so on. The U.S., and I think very naturally and understandably, has kind of always seen Pakistan as the country that's living next to a big problem that the U.S. has. So it was the Soviet Union, and we wanted a place to base spy planes to go look into Soviet Central Asia and so on, and Pakistan was there. We were worried in the 50s that communism would expand and come down to the Persian Gulf. Pakistan was there, so you make them an ally and they're a buffer. Then in the 70s, we want to open relations with China, Nixon and Kissinger. Well, Pakistan has great relations. They're our friends, so they'll be the broker, and so they're useful. The Soviets invade Afghanistan. We got to drive them out to win the Cold War. Pakistan's there. We'll do it through Pakistan. So the U.S. is always seeing Pakistan as a tool for some bigger cause. Again, understandably. But missing in that picture all the time was the inherent importance of Pakistan. Potentially, but also that if you treat people as a tool and not as inherently important, at some point that will have its limitations. And so we've gotten to that point where now Pakistan is a country of 175 million people, which is, I think it's like the 5th most populous country in the world, 5th or 6th. It has nuclear weapons. It sits geographically in an important place, and it produces the terrorists that we tend to be fighting around the world. But you can't enable or help Pakistan be the way it needs to be to work in the world if you keep treating it as a means to an end. You have to treat Pakistan itself as the challenge, the thing that's worth trying to help improve, not to accomplish some other goal, but you just have to be willing to try to help Pakistan work for Pakistanis. And that's the shift that's been made in the last couple of years. I think there is a greater awareness in Washington that has to be done. And part of that's reflected in shifting, or at least adding, civilian assistance to what has always been a militarily dominated relationship between the two. So the idea that we can't just do business with the Pakistani army, we've got to develop civilian institutions. But that's very incomplete, that awareness and that focus on Pakistan. And then it's very hard to work there. So what we're doing there actually is also backfiring, even with good intentions. One of them has begun by accident as a result of the Osama bin Laden aftermath, which is, you know, the U.S. said, okay, well, we're going to withhold $800 million in assistance to the military because the military wasn't doing what they said they were supposed to do. And now the military says, we don't want it. That's good. The U.S. should, not in a punitive way, I would argue, but understand that the Pakistani army was never going to fight our fight. And so for 10 years, we've been trying to get the Pakistani army and ISI to help fight the Haqqani network and others that are operating from Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the Pakistanis always have felt that's your fight, America. You know, those are your enemies in Afghanistan. You want us to fight them. They're not our enemies. And that's right. And we kept deluding ourselves. We gave them a little more money or threatened to withdraw some money. Somehow they would turn on these guys. Well, that's not going to happen. We should stop pretending it, but we should withdraw the money. What we should do is say, look, our highest priority is the security and eventual reduction of violence in Pakistan. We want to protect Pakistani lives. We want you, the Pakistani security services, to protect the rights and lives of your people. So, if you're prepared to go after the internal terrorists in Pakistan, to strengthen your police, to disband jihadi groups, to go in when mosques and other places are recruiting people and it's obvious they're recruiting them to become terrorists, to go in and interrupt that. If you want to do that, we're prepared to provide whatever help you think we could that would be useful. But we're not going to keep pushing you to fight our war. So that's one thing. Focus on the internal struggle in Pakistan and the police and more civilian institutions. There's another thing, which is economically, the U.S. Is willing to provide billions of dollars in assistance to Pakistan, but a few members of Congress are blocking the lowering of tariffs on Pakistani textiles and apparel. That's one of Pakistan's big industries. It's primitive, but it's what they do. But because of high U.S. tariff rates, they can't sell many of their products in the U.S. And a few members in Congress, to protect the tiny industry in the U.S., won't lower those tariff rates, which would make a big difference in Pakistan, and wouldn't be aid, it would be trade. And we always say trade, not aid, because trade is so much more dignified. It makes people, you know, genuinely be and feel prouder. But when it comes to Pakistan, who's our great friend, no, we can't lower those tariff rates, which, by the way, would hurt the Chinese more than anybody else, because they would be the ones that would lose market share. So that's something we could do. There's another thing to do, which is in the very understandable effort to build a relationship with India, sometimes the U.S. Acts in ways that suggest to Pakistanis and other Muslims that their lives are worth much less than Indians. So when there's a terrorist attack in India, we very correctly denounce it and show great concern. But when Pakistanis are victims of terrorist attack, as happened with a train that was coming from India to Pakistan and people were burned alive. And it happens in Kashmir when Muslims have been abused by the security forces. We don't say anything. The U.S. doesn't say anything. But to Pakistanis, what's happened to their people or to fellow Muslims is an act of terror. And in their view, it's being done by a friend of the U.S. and the U.S. isn't saying anything. And yet whenever Pakistan does something, there's this denunciation. So I think a greater expression of respect for lives wherever they're lost, or the violation of human rights wherever it occurs, would be useful in Pakistan. And then lastly, the U.S. has made, beginning in 2009, under the Kerry-Lugar-Berman legislation, more assistance available for civilian work and development work in Pakistan. but it's so encumbered by, again, understandable concerns about corruption that very little of the assistance is actually being delivered. And the conditions that are required, I joke, it's the Full Employment for Pakistani Accountants Act. So basically, to reassure Congress that money is not being misspent, people are having to hire all these accountants in organizations that are tiny grassroots organizations. It's absurd. Not that corruption's a good thing, but basically you can, in trying to prevent a scandal by some guy in Congress standing up and saying, my God, this money's been misspent, you end up spending more U.S. taxpayer dollars with all of the red tape and all the bureaucracy and all of the conditions that are putting on the aid, than if you just went ahead and allowed normal vetting and you took the risk of corruption. So it's stupid. It's all about covering people's behinds, and we do that. And then also, because of security reasons and other reasons, the people who are supposed to be out, U.S. officials, figuring out who to give the money to or whom to make grants to, they rotate every year. They're not in the country for as much as a year, and then they rotate out. So they don't know the place. They don't have the network. So it's destined to fail. It's destined not to work. And so we ought to pause it. Basically, don't take the money off the table, but pause and work with Pakistani counterparts and multinational actors that are there and can operate more freely and securely to figure out how to pool investments and the willingness of the U.S. to provide resources to Pakistan so that they actually get there. Because right now it's counterproductive. It's everybody in Pakistan knows this stuff's not getting there. They know all of these horror stories. People in Washington know the stories. And so what was intended to be an expression of genuine cooperation and a desire for Pakistan's success is now again the sign of the opposite.